Our next speaker is Nathan Lewin, who comes from a renowned line of Polish rabbis. He and his family were directly impacted by the events under discussion today. 3 of his grandparents were murdered in the Holocaust, and he and his parents were among the Jewish refugees rescued by Jewryin, the Japanese consul in Kovno. They arrived in the United States in 1941. Nathan Lewin studied at Harvard Law School, clerk of justice, joined in Harlem in the Supreme Court, and then served in the US Department of Justice, was Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division. He's presented 28 oral arguments in the Supreme Court of the United States, including the 3 most important cases involving Jewish religious rights argued in the last 30 years. He's a former president of the Jewish Community Council of Greater Washington. Mr. Lewin has dedicated much of his time and energy to advocacy on behalf of the Jewish community. He currently teaches at Columbia University Law School and practices law with his daughter Eliza at Lewin & Lewin LLP in Washington, D.C., and we're very honored and privileged to have him with us today.
Growing up in New York in the early 1940s, I heard this recited by my father, Zichrono Livracha, every Saturday night after he completed Havdalah. Yiddish was not the language we spoke at home. As soon as they settled in the United States, my parents, both fluent linguists, took to learning English. They trained me, then their only child, to speak English at home. But this Yiddish phrase, der Seite so bald befreit werden, still rings in my ears. I was 5 years old when we landed in San Francisco on March 20th, 1941, on a ship that came from Yokohama, Japan. My mother, Allahu Shalom, had secured for our immediate family the first of the celebrated transit visas issued by Jewryin Sugihara, the Japanese consul in Kovno, Kaunas, Lithuania. Having been a Dutch citizen before marrying my father, and thereby legally becoming a Polish citizen and losing her Dutch citizenship, she nonetheless corresponded with the Dutch ambassador in Riga to find a safe haven other than Vilna, which was, she correctly surmised, in Hitler's evil scheme of conquering Europe. Dutch Ambassador de Decker wrote to my mother that no visa was needed to enter Suriname or Curaçao, Dutch colonies near South America. Reading this declaration as a Curaçao visa, Consul Sugihara, a righteous Gentile deservingly enshrined in Yad Vashem, defied instructions from Tokyo and issued over 2,000 transit visas in August 1940 to Jews who had fled Poland, including the Mir Yeshiva. Do I have a personal recollection of our life in the United States where we found refuge during the early 1940s while Hitler and his murderous cohorts were diabolically eradicating the historic Jewish communities of Europe? I even don't have any recollection whatever of the 2 weeks that my parents and I spent on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, traveling from Moscow to Vladivostok in 1940, when I was 4 years old. It's therefore not surprising that I remember little of my life in America before my bar mitzvah. I do recall, however, the subject that monopolized my father's days and nights after we arrived in America. It was Hatzot, wrestling. My father was the eldest son of the renowned rabbi of Poland, of Rasha, Rzeszów in Polish, who the Jews of Poland twice elected to the Polish parliament, the Senate. Rabbi Aaron Lewin, pronounced Lewin in Poland, was a great Talmud Chacham who published halachic responsa, a magnificent commentary on much of Maseches Brachos, and a commentary on Torah that he composed while riding weekly first class at government expense from Russia to Warsaw for meetings of the Senate. He was self-taught in Polish and German. When I was growing up, I heard from people who had heard his speeches in Yiddish, in Polish, in German, and they all said he was an astounding orator. While still in his 20s, my father wrote articles in those three languages, and they were published in Polish periodicals. My father received a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Lvov in 1937, after my parents married and settled in the city of Lodz, where I was born. My father confessed to me that he attended few, if any, of the lectures on law in Lvov, Lemberg to the Jews, but his thesis and written work won him the degree in law. Because he also had smicha, he was addressed as Rabbi Dr. Lewin for the rest of his life. Having settled in Lodz in 1935, after his marriage to the daughter of a prosperous Amsterdam businessman, who was ultimately murdered in Auschwitz, my father was promptly elected by the Jews of Lodz to the city council. In this capacity, he battled local Polish anti-Semitic council members who, according to the council's official transcript, jeered at my father and called on him and Polish Jews to, quote, go back to Palestine. We arrived in New York in mid-1941 and settled in Williamsburg and later in Manhattan's West Side. It was natural for my father to turn to the Yiddish press in New York City and offer to write columns for the Yiddish newspapers. That was, to my knowledge, how we supported our family in those early days after we arrived in America. 3 Yiddish newspapers appeared daily on local newsstands in New York in the 1940s. Orthodox Jews bought and read the Morgenjournal. Those who were less devout read the Talmud. Socialist free thinkers read the Farvards, the granddaddy of today's poet. For a frum Jew to be caught reading the Farvards was like catching a cussed reading Playboy. My father became a regular correspondent for the Morgenjournal and for its weekly magazine supplement, Der Amerikaner. He was given free rein to choose his subjects. My father's favorite plaything was his portable Hebrew typewriter. I would fall asleep each night in the living room of our 1-bedroom apartment to the clickety-clack of that machine. My father was a hundred-pet typist, using 2 index fingers at incredible speed. Besides the racket of the typewriter, I was awakened at night while asleep on the living room sofa and while my father was working to answer phone calls for individuals who I then thought had exotic multi-syllable names who were calling on urgent rescue issues and to arrange meetings. Kalmanovich, Shenkolevsky. These were the names that were common in our home. My father made contact soon after arrival in the U.S. with Rabbi Eliezer Silver of Cincinnati and with other rabbis and Orthodox Jewish leaders who were in the forefront of Hatzolah activities. My father volunteered to be the chief of staff, Morenu Yaakov Rosenheim, president of the International Agudas Yisrael movement, who had reached America as a refugee in 1940. Rosenheim and the American Aguda's tireless leader, Mike Tress, worked around the clock to rescue Jews trapped in Europe. My father's primary concern while learning English and trying to eke out a living was of the Jews trapped in Polish ghettos. No one spoke on the subject more forcefully than he did. The Gemara in Yevamos, Daf Tzadi Zayin Amar Aleph says, Kol Talmid Chacham she'omrin davar shmua min piv b'olam hazeh tzivtotav tovavot hakever. When words uttered by a deceased Talmid Chacham are repeated today, it's as if his lips speak in the grave. Tzivtotav tovavot. In this talk, I can do no better than repeat for you some of my father's more dynamic utterances, followed by my own pedestrian translation. An article, my father, as I said, arrived in 1941. Our good friend Mikhail Pomerantz, who's there, has given me a copy of a notice in which my father, Rabbi Cutler, and another were posted in Detroit in May of 1941 on their arrival in the United States. But my father, within that 1 year, and after having been hired by the Mogul Journal, wrote an article in February 1942, 1 year after he came to America. It was headlined, Wird man lassen untergehen, die Jiden in die Polish ghettos. Will we permit the eradication of Jews in Polish ghettos? His language was compelling in describing the suffering that he had been described to him. Kein Speis wird nicht zugelassen ahin, kurz die kleine Ratios, welche die gewöhnliche losen allein mit starkem Hunger und Kälte. Wie lang kann anhaltendem Leben von unseren Brüdern und Schwestern in die dosige Besündigung? How long can our brothers and sisters survive? Es können bleiben von sei nur Quoren und efshel das nicht. There was a telling prophecy. All that will be left of them will be graves, and maybe not even that. He initiated a refrain that he sounded over the succeeding months and years. Wie soll reagiert der Amerikaner Judentum auf dem dortigen Matze, welcher soll sein Gleichen nicht in der ganzen jüdischen Martyrologie von tausender Jahren. How can American Jewry react to this condition, unparalleled in the thousands years of martyrology of Jewish history? And he concluded, as became customary in his writings, with a call to action. Lamotun was es lustig noch, kedei zu retten von schrecklichen Hunger und Tod die Millionen unschuldige Korbones in die Ghetto Gehennems, von welches es da nicht Es ist nicht leicht. Fordert Arbeit, fordert Bemühungen, aber kann das sein an Aufhalt? Nicht warten, nicht schweigen. We must do everything possible to rescue them from the terrible starvation. These millions of innocent martyrs in the ghetto purgatories. The route is before us. It is not easy. It takes labor and dedication, but can that be a deterrent? Do not delay. Do not be silent. He continued to call urgently for help by America to the Jews trapped in ghettos during the first half of 1942. A long piece in the Tug in May described fatal epidemics and starvation, terrible conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto. And then, in August and September 1942, came the cables from Gerhard Riegner and Isaac Sternberg, which described the Nazi genocidal program already underway to murder the millions of Jews in German-occupied Europe. Riegner reported on August 8, 1942, the Nazi plan that, quote, all Jews in countries occupied or controlled by Germany, numbering 3.5 to 4 million, should, after deportation and concentration in the East, be at one blow exterminated in order to resolve once and for all the Jewish question in Europe. The State Department, when told about this, called this, quote, a wild rumor fueled by Jewish anxieties. My father personally saw the Sternberg telegram, which arrived in September because it was sent to Yaakov Rosenheim through the diplomatic pouch of the Polish government in exile. Rosenheim and my father sent the news to both President Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, but neither did anything. Rosenheim demanded a meeting with Stephen Wise, who met them on September 4th, and he said the reports were atrocity tales, and he ordered them to be silent. After 2 months of compelled silence, my father blasted Wise in November 1942. He asked, haben die Führer von amerikanisch-jüdischer Organisation welche seinen von 3. September und Gestalt geworden an einer Alarm zu sind sie jetzt gewesen, seine jüdische und menschliche Pflicht, ist beklar etwas getan geworden, that the leaders of the American Jewish organizations who should have been at alarm stations fulfill their Jewish and human obligation. Was anything done? The news delivered by cable, he said, stimmt auf, weil es geschieht, solches, was ist noch bis heint nicht der Held geworden. Be on alarm, because something is created which has never before been heard of. Die erste Pflicht von die Führer von die Organisations ist also gewesen, zu alarmieren weiter die Öffentlichkeit. The first duty of the Jewish leaders was to raise an alarm among those who were available to hear it. My father was then 36 years old and struggling to adjust to a land and language that he had never anticipated in his wildest childhood dream. But he took on senior American leaders unmercifully. He reported in his columns that doctor, he never called him a rabbi, Stephen Wise, had issued a chayra, an excommunication ban against publicizing the frightful information he had received. Instead of klingen auf alle Glocken, ringing all alarm bells, and rousing American and British Jewry, Wise had decreed total silence on everyone. My father denounced both of Wise's flimsy pretexts for silence. that the news was not yet verified and that its disclosure would harm Europe's Jews by angering Germany and its sympathizers. The issue, said my father, is Kiyum Ha'omah, survival of the Jewish nation. While Wise suppressed the news, das jüdische Blut weitergeflossen. Jewish blood continued to flow. Is it enough, my father asked caustically, that Dr. Wise and Dr. Nachum Goldman took one trip in 40 days for a visit to Washington? He concluded his attack on the Jewish leadership with a moving query. Men fragt die Führer von jüdischen Organisaties in Amerika, ma tanu liyom pkuda, was wird ihr antworten, ob man wird einmal von euch annehmen, a Cheshbon, was ihr hat getan, wenn die Blut von eurer Brüder hat sich gegossen in Strahlen. We asked the leaders of American Jewish organizations, how will you respond on the day of reckoning? How will you answer when you must account for what you did when the blood of your Jewish brethren was gushing? I wish I could report to you today that I witnessed my father's courage and took pride in it. But I was 7 years old, and even in wartime, with constant anxiety being expressed all around me about the fate of our people trapped in Hitler's grip, I was busy becoming an all-American boy, captivated only by baseball, football, basketball, and ice hockey. My personal contribution was occasionally accompanying my father to the Lower East Side to deliver his manuscript to the office of the Morgen Journal on an upper floor in a decrepit office building. What recollection do I have? We entered an elevator whose aged operator would get it to the higher floor by pulling strenuously on a thick cord and via some pulley mechanism lifted the elevator cage. But when he finally decided that the news could no longer be suppressed, Dr. Wise created a joint emergency committee on European Jewish affairs that was to take productive steps to stop the killings. The committee existed for 8 months, between March and November 1943. The most generous description of this effort is that it was, as one researcher called it, a forlorn attempt at cooperative activity. Because he had been such an outspoken critic of American apathy, my father was asked to attend meetings of this joint emergency committee. In a long article that appeared in the Morgen Journal of August 26, 1943, my father said that there were still ways to prevent the shchitas, the slaughters of Jews in Nazi-occupied land. He reported that he proposed to the committee that it initiate an international protest to demonstrate to the Nazis, who seemed to be proud of what they were doing, that they will be condemned rather than praised for killing Jews. Again, for was die jüdische Amerika? For was schläft die jüdische Amerika? Why is Jewish America asleep? For was merkt man nicht mehr getan zu die liebe Juden von Europa, auf welche es hat sich ausgegossen in schreckliche Katastrophe da in America. Why is there no assistance to the Jews who are the victims of great catastrophe? He says, ich habe gegeben dem Vorland von die polnische Juden übergegeben der Joint Emergency Committee. He says at a meeting of the Joint Emergency Committee, he submitted a proposal which was accepted But finally, after a lot of controversy, it was accepted. But nonetheless, he says, mir ist aber nicht bewusst, von etwas ist noch dem Tage getan geworden. Was anything actually done? Why is Jewish America asleep? He says. So he concluded that, I'll give you the English. It's an open secret. The Joint Emergency Committee is incompetent. It exists only on paper. This committee should be active today with an office, with employees who carry out its decisions. But what it is, it's truly a Heisek, a laughingstock. It meets once in several weeks, parentheses. Yes, once in several weeks. Its meetings are run by the clock. After each meeting, nothing is implemented. 1 hour after the meeting, no one remembers what was discussed. It's time, he said, that Jewish America should demand an accounting. It should call on Washington to go to the United Nations, warn the German government. Every day is crucial. Well, this Joint Emergency Committee was formally dissolved on November 5, 1943. Dr. Wise, Dr. Goldman, other Jewish leaders transferred its responsibility to an entity called the American Jewish Conference, which purported to speak for 32 national Jewish organizations. But it was as internally rivalry-ridden and ineffective as its predecessor. Agudath Israel refused to join, and one researcher reports that its minutes contain the following statement. I quote, Rabbi Lewin of the Agudath Israel was noted as referring to the goddamn conference. Now, I don't know the content of that statement or the Yiddish, Hebrew, or Polish equivalent of what my father said, nor do I believe that my father, even the most angry Jewish leadership, would have publicly resorted to this language. But I am proud that history will report that he made this evaluation. The American Jewish Conference did one thing. It attacked Peter Bergson, who had organized the celebrated Rabbis' March on Washington, which occurred 3 days before Yom Kippur in 1943. My father not only participated actively in this demonstration, but also recruited other participants. On the list of, quote, rabbis who made the trip by train from New York to Washington are some non-rabbinic Balabatim who happen to be members of our shtibel in New York. A December 1943 article by my father is titled, The Hour Strikes Midnight. Die Shah schlägt Spell. This is the title that Rafi Medoff chose for this talk. And as the war was ending, my father says the danger to the Jews who have survived increases. Internal partisan strife may eliminate the chance to help the Sheiros HaKli. The amazing thing is that Breckinridge Long, the major anti-Semite who controlled American policy during this period of time, in his own diaries, described graphically the internal division that paralyzed the Jewish community during the war. In February 1944, my father called again for saving Jews. It's not a time, he said, for Hespedim. America, he said, is asleep in its Hatzolah Arbeit. Now, the time I have been allotted does not enable me to give you a full report on his other articles or other wartime activities. You can read selected articles in a volume he published titled Korban Europa and Post-War Reports in Nachrichten after the Holocaust. He was assigned in July 1945, very soon after VE Day, to be one of the few American rabbis, now he was not yet a U.S. citizen, to visit Europe and the Sheretz HaKleipah. He went again in June 1946 with Rabbi Eliezer Silver as official U.S. representatives, and both proudly wore the uniform of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, as distinguished, of course, from UNRW. My father's presence in America enabled him to condemn America's silence and passivity during the war years. After the war, he fought for Jewish rights at the United Nations and in the halls of Congress. One major product of the Shoah that drew his attention and efforts was the repatriation of Jewish orphans who had been hidden from the Nazi murderers. He did not leave America and come on Aliyah to Israel. But I should disclose now a conversation I heard when Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Levin, not a relative, he was a Cohen, made one of his many visits to our home in New York. Rabbi Levin was the leader of Agudas Yisrael in Israel and a signer of Israel's Declaration of Independence. He told my father in my presence that had he come on Aliyah and been in Israel in 1948 when the state was established, he would have been the only renowned Agudist with a law degree and would have been the Aguda designee to Israel's Supreme Court. Because my father was not available, Professor Simchat Saf, Colonel Bracha, who had no legal background, was named to the seat that had been reserved for a Dati justice. I must end this talk by completing the circle. The Zayda's fight felon did not come to pass. At war's end, my father learned that his father, Bereisha Rav, was murdered, together with his brother, Rabbi Pesca Levin, in a Ukrainian pogrom on June 30, 1941, as Russian troops were leaving Lemberg and the Nazis were entering. His widow, my grandmother, was then hidden in a bunker in Lemberg, was discovered and gassed in Belzels, as was my father's elder sister, who had lived in Lemberg. My father's introduction to Korban Rocha is a moving memorial to the immediate family members he lost. Hashem Yinkom Damo. Will Rafi please come up and join me up here on the stage? Where is it? Oh, there.
Thank you, Nat, for that very interesting and very moving description of your father's efforts during the Shoah. There is a remarkable difference, it seems to me, in the way that Orthodox activists, such as your father, responded to the news of the Holocaust, and the way that reform and conservative movements in the United States responded. This is something that I've noticed in my own research. I'd like to share something about that and then ask you how you see this. So, Dr. Isaac Lewin was part of the Agudas Yisrael, which was part of kind of a circle of Orthodox Jews, rabbis in New York, who had really three agencies. There was Agudas Yisrael, there was the Union of Orthodox Rabbis, or the Agudas HaRabbanim, as was known, and then the rescue committee that they established called the Vad HaTzalah. But there was nothing comparable to this in the other major Jewish denominations. Neither the Reform nor the conservative religious movements, neither Reform Judaism nor conservative Judaism ever established a rescue committee. In my research, I found one stirring of interest in this area in the conservative movement, and that was a small group of students at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1942 who created their own little action committee to cry out about the Holocaust. But they told me, when I interviewed them many years later, obviously, they told me that the administration of the Jewish Theological Seminary is the flagship institution of conservative Judaism. The administration, the faculty included many of the preeminent Jewish intellectuals and conservative rabbinical figures of that era, was utterly indifferent to the activities of their little group. And so their group consisted of three guys in a dormitory with an old typewriter. And they were never given resources or assistance by the movement of which they were a part. My sense from studying these movements and my perception of American Jewry in those days is that the difference in response, the energetic Orthodox response as compared to what seems to have been a generally apathetic response by the conservative and reform movements, is this. To a large extent, American Jewish responses to news of the Holocaust was shaped by concern about how crying out against the persecution would be perceived by non-Jewish Americans. Orthodox activists such as your father were immigrants, or in many cases, you mentioned names like Kamenovich and Shenkelovsky and Rosenheim. So these men were born in Europe. They were recent immigrants, but because they were devoutly Orthodox, they were not particularly concerned about melting into American society, about how they would be perceived by non-Jews. These are men with black hats and long beards, and they knew they were different. They didn't have much of a chance of assimilating, nor were they interested in assimilating. So it seems to me that for them, psychologically, the barriers to crying out, to protesting, to being seen as Jewish or actively Jewish was not something that filled them with anxiety. Whereas, broadly speaking, among the other movements, there was the reform and conservative movements. Their leadership was populated largely by people who were much more concerned about integrating into American society. And therefore, for them, the idea of a public protest, something that might annoy the American Jewish public or the president, that was something that they would have been more sensitive to, and thus would have made them more reluctant to protest in the way that Isaac Lewin and his colleagues did. What do you think of that? And did your father ever point to a difference in the reaction between Orthodox and non-Orthodox segments of the Jewish community?
Well, very telling was the statement that was made to President Roosevelt when the rabbis came to Washington and his advisors told him, these are not the Jews you want to associate with. The fact is, rabbis' beards, and you saw this picture, most of them had beards, wearing hats. These were not people who the Stephen Wises of the United States could identify with. And I have to say, it seems to me, there were people with whom the Stephen Wises and the Jews who were modern American secularists did not really feel sorry for. I mean, they were strange people over in Europe. True, they were Jewish, but they were not the Jews that Wise and his associates could really view as being their type of people. So I think it was not simply that they didn't, that they were embarrassed to be associated with them. I think they really didn't care about them that much. That was the real tragedy, that the Jews who came, like my father, really cared, not only for his immediate family, but for the whole Polish Jewish establishment and what it meant. Were met with a view in the United States that said, oh, those are people over there, fine, that inhuman things are being done to them. But there's a lot of people in the world, as you said this morning, presidents feel, well, we're not going to get involved with the inhumanity that's done to strange people abroad. and to Stephen Wise and Nachum Goldman and the people who were leading the American Jewish organizations, these were strange people in Poland who they did not really feel for.
We have time now for some questions. Please raise your hand. One second, let me pass you the microphone. Please, can you pass it?
How come Herzl did have feelings towards Jews who were different and wanted to save them, and American Jews who were Reformed Jews did not want to?
Well, I think Herzl took a more universal view of the question. I mean, his question, the Judenstaat, the whole question of having a Jewish nation was a much broader issue. After all, in the United States, there was substantial views, and that was one of the controversies that paralyzed the American Jewish community, was Zionism. The American Council for Judaism thought that was foreign to American notions, to be supporting a country for Jews, whether it's in Israel, whether it's in Palestine, or whether it's in Uganda or someplace else, but for the Jews to get together in a nation of their own. Herzl's view, I think, was a much more universal Jewish perspective. And that's why he was able, but he had, after all, he had his enemies. I have to admit that I think in Herzl's diaries, one of the people who he discusses as opposed to him was my great-great-great-grandfather, the Rav Yitzchak Shmelkes, the Beis Yitzchak, whose view was that it was wrong to do the kinds of thing that Herzl was doing. But nonetheless, Herzl's view, I think, was a more encompassing view of Jewish identity.
I don't need a microphone. Okay, fine. I would like to know what was the attitude of the youth movements, of the Jewish youth movements.
Could you repeat that question?
The Jewish youth movements, weren't they involved in any way in trying to rescue European Jewry? Because my knowledge, I'm from the Beitar movement, was that the Beitar in America also assisted the Bergson group, as well as the revisionists, and they certainly weren't religious as such. Your comments, please.
Well, I'm sure, and I defer to Rafi on this, but I'm sure that the Bergson group was supported by many non-Orthodox and secular segments of the Jewish community. After all, the great production in Madison Square Garden was not one that was a good idea. It was directed to a much broader Jewish audience, a much broader American audience than the Orthodox Jews with the rabbis of the Aguda.
Let's start with the Zionist youth movements, from right to left. Hashomer HaTzair, B'nai Akiva, we mentioned Beitar. For the most part, those groups were heavily focused on directly preparing for making Aliyah. They had agricultural training sites, and that was their whole focus on making Aliyah, as opposed to, let's say, political activism. I did find evidence in my research of some Beitar youth being involved in, you mentioned protests at the Bergson group, also protests organized by Ben-Zion Netanyahu and the revisionist Zionist organization in America. And among others, young Moshe Ahrens, for example, was a Beitar activist who was also was involved in assisting Ben-Zion Netanyahu and the revisionists in youth. But by and large, there are two reasons why those youth movements do not appear prominently in this story. The first I mentioned is their focus on practical training because they were actually going to make Aliyah. The second thing is the Zionist Jewish youth movements in this period, especially in the 40s, were not large because obviously a lot of their young men were drafted. So it was not a time when those movements would have been at their peak in terms of manpower or resources, given those circumstances. Yes, could you pass the microphone to the back, please? Thank you.
May I ask a question in Hebrew?
Pardon?
May I ask the question in Hebrew?
כן.
אוקיי, טוב. אני חושב שההאשמה הזאת כלפי גולדמן ווייז היא לא הוגנת. והיא לא הוגנת משתי סיבות. אחת, כי אנחנו לא יודעים נבחי לב. זאת אומרת, זאת השקפה שאין לה בסיס, אני לא מכיר שום, אפילו עדות לציטוט מווייז או מגולדמן או מאנשים דומים להם, שאומרים לא אכפת לנו מיהודי אירופה, הדתיים הם לא משלנו. ושתיים, זאת חזרה על סוג של, זו לא פעם ראשונה, שאנשים שבאים מהכיוון של אגודת ישראל, מהכיוון החרדי, הסאטמרים, זה עוד יותר גרוע, מטיחים במנהיגים מהסוג הזה, סוג של טענה שהיא חסרת בסיס. אין לי אף מילה טובה להגיד על העובדה שווייז בתקופת השואה לא עשה את מה שיכול היה לעשות, וזה מה יש. אבל להגיד שזה בא מתוך חוסר אכפתי, אני לא חושב שיש לזה בסיס.
חשבתי שאני לא הבנתי את השאלה. יכול לתרגם לאנגלית או Can somebody just give me the question?
Statement. It wasn't a question.
Sort of simple. What?
Well, he says that although the reform leaders in America didn't pay attention to Jews, it does not mean that they didn't care for Orthodox Jews. He has not found any evidence that even Jews like Dr. Wise did not like Orthodox Jews in Europe. He objects to what you said.
I understand that, but the problem is you can only judge him by his deeds. And the fact is that Dr. Wise, when he was informed twice in August and September of 1942 of a plan to decimate and destroy the European Jewish community from authorities that were pretty authoritative, he chose to say it is better to keep quiet because the State Department and the president, who I discovered this morning, he was never even photographed with that president, but certainly the Jews at the time thought that Wise was close to Roosevelt. And yet what Wise said is, don't disseminate that information. The fact is, his deeds led to the destruction and prevented efforts that I agree, it's only might, but that might have saved millions of Jews. So, what kind of...
If I might add to that. Of course, it's always complicated trying to analyze, in retrospect, people's motives. So when we say that someone didn't care, let's say, about the Jews in Europe, I mean, that is making an important point, but obviously, as he just indicated, ultimately we can only judge leaders of that period, or anybody, by what they did and what they said. There's no doubt that there was a certain amount of anti-Orthodox, and I'm saying Orthodox here, you said Haredi, but in those days, Haredi, of course, was not a word that was used, so let's just say Orthodox. There was a certain amount of anti-Orthodox sentiment among non-Orthodox Jews in the United States. There's no doubt about that. We know from some of the writings or sermons of, let's say, Reform rabbis. There was a certain amount of that.
And it continues to be today.
And there continues to be, because unfortunately, there is prejudice between different segments of American Jewry. And it goes both ways. It's not just Reform Jews disliking Orthodox Jews. Sometimes it goes both ways. And it's tragic, obviously, in both situations. And when we look at the tensions between Orthodox and Reform rabbis, let's say in the 40s, we sometimes do find in the documents expressions of hostility that we would consider to be, let's say anti-Orthodox. It's hard to know how much of that shaped, for example, Rabbi Stephen Wise's response to the Holocaust. He clearly resented Isaac Lewin and the Agudas Yisrael and Vad Hatzalah crap. He clearly resented them. But you can imagine in Wise's case, he had about 5 different reasons why he resented them. The fact that they were black-hatted Orthodox Jews, he couldn't have been crazy about that. To what extent it motivated him, hard to know. Rabbi Wise was a very acculturated, very Americanized rabbi. And so he was not personally comfortable with bearded, black-coated Orthodox rabbis. That's true. But perhaps even more than that, these were black-hatted, bearded Orthodox rabbis who were challenging the President of the United States, who were arguing, in Isaac Lewin's case, that the Jewish leadership had failed, who were saying that the United States can and should do something to rescue Jews from the Holocaust. So the rescue activists, the Orthodox groups, the Bergson group, who are not Orthodox, they all gave Wise plenty of reason for anguish. We may never know the full answer to the question of what motivated Rabbi Wise or what motivated the others. And I do not argue, and the Jews should keep quiet, that Wise did not care about Europe's Jews, only because it's hard to measure that sort of thing precisely. But I argue that fundamentally the problem with his leadership was that even if he did care, and let's for the sake of argument, we give him the benefit of the doubt, to the extent that he cared, he was nevertheless unable, unwilling to overcome his deep affection for President Roosevelt, his close identification with the Democratic Party and therefore never having relationships with the Republicans, his utter inability to allow dissidents such as the Bergson group to have a say or a voice or to be even part of the conversation anyway. There's so many reasons that stood in the way of Rabbi Wise doing what Jewish leaders arguably should have been doing in response to the news of the mass killings in Europe.
And let me add something. I mean, to Rabbi Wise's credit, the documents, I think, show that in speaking with Jewish officials, and particularly Felix Frankfurter, for example, to whom Wise apparently confided after the Regner and Sternberg telegrams, and said to Frankfurter that he was kept awake at night because of the responsibility that he felt regarding the Jews of Europe. So that he was not reluctant to speak to Frankfurter about that, about the Jews, but he was reluctant to address the president, to address Roosevelt about that.
Yes, that's a good point.
Can I say something?
Do you have a question? Wait, is it a question?
Not really, it's a statement, 2 minutes. I just want to say one thing.
I apologize, but generally, to preserve the format of this event, it's more helpful if you have a specific question rather than a 2-minute address, as you say. So could you turn it into a question?
I studied under your father, Dr. Isaac Lewin, Oliver Shalom, and he was an amazing person. There was nobody better than him. I had him as a teacher in Revel 50 years ago. Oliver Shalom was really amazing. That's one thing. And I don't know if you ever heard this theory, that the American jury was afraid to demonstrate and do too much because they were afraid they were going to be killed in America just like the Jews were being killed in Europe. Did you ever hear that theory?
It's an interesting point. Thank you for raising that.
Some American Jews once said that to my parents when they came.
Well, when the 400 rabbis were preparing to go to Washington to march to the White House and to plead for rescue, so Rabbi Wise and a few other prominent Jews, like Congressman Saul Bloom, tried to discourage them from coming, warning them that protesting in front of the White House and looking as Jewish as they did could cause pogroms in the United States. A similar warning was raised at one point in response to one of the newspaper ads that the Bergson group was planning. They had an ad scheduled that was supposed to be in the New York Times in mid-1943. It was delayed because there was in general during the war there was a shortage of newsprint of available space, and so groups that could not afford premium space would kind of wait in line. So the Berkson group had an ad that was in line but had not yet appeared, which included a sarcastic reference to the fact that apparently Goebbels had at one point been quoted as saying that by Christmas time there will be no Jews left alive. And the ad, which was written by Ben Heck, the famous Hollywood screenwriter who was active in the Berkson group, the ad sarcastically said, well then, the rest of the world apparently will be happy because there will be no more Jews around to bother you. So, while the ad was waiting in line, somebody at the New York Times leaked the content of it to Rabbi Wise and some of his other colleagues, several of whom called Berkson in for an urgent meeting. And they tried to persuade him. These are Rabbi Wise's very close colleagues in the American Zionist movement and the American Jewish Congress. And also the head of the American Jewish Committee, Joseph Proskauer, was at this meeting. They tried to persuade Berkson, Hecht. No, I'm sorry, it was Berkson. They tried to persuade Berkson that there would be pogroms in the United States if he printed what they called such an anti-Christian advertisement in the New York Times. Berkson said to them he was willing to withhold the ad if they would make the issue of rescue a top agenda item in their Joint Emergency Committee for European Jewish Affairs, which Nat described earlier. And according to this, all comes from Berkson's account, but I generally have found Berkson's memoirs and recollections to be accurate. According to Berkson, they promised him that they would have a greater focus on rescue if he would just cancel the ad. So he pulled the ad, and then months went by, and Berkson said he would repeatedly call up the office at Proskauer's office, and the other one, Herman Schulman was the other one, call their offices, what's happening, what are you doing? And after a certain point, it became clear that they were not going to make rescue a serious priority. And the ad eventually ran. The ad actually appeared in the New York Times, you can see it. It appeared in the fall of 1943. And needless to say, no pogroms ensued. Now, what's my point? My point is, if you're a Jewish leader and you are really afraid there might be pogroms as a result of marching rabbis or a Barb newspaper ad, fine. It doesn't make you crazy. It makes you worried at a time when there's a lot of anti-Semitism. And you warn the activists this could backfire. Maybe these hotheads, Berkson, the others, Betsy and Netanyahu, with their militant approach, maybe they don't know enough about America's ways. Fine. You can take that position. But once the march is over, once the newspaper ad appears in the New York Times and there are no pogroms, it seems to me that a responsible Jewish leader at that point needs to kind of rethink his position and recognize that, okay, it turns out it was a mistake. My fears were exaggerated. You guys were right that time. Maybe marching is not such a dangerous thing. Maybe a newspaper ad is not going to set off a tidal wave of anti-Jewish violence. I think that's the point. It's not that Wise and the others were completely irrational in being so worried. It's that once their worries were proven by events to have been unfounded, that's the point at which they really needed to reconsider what they had been advocating. The events I'm describing, the march, the ad, were 1943. The Holocaust was far from over. World War II was far from over. There was still plenty of time, so to speak, for responsible Jewish leaders in the United States to organize serious protests if they had recognized that their previous approach had been in error. Yes, where's the microphone? Can you pass it on? Okay. When you're done, can you pass it down to that side, please? Go ahead.
The title of the book and this whole meeting is the question answered that Jews should speak out loudly. But why are we focused so much just on the past when right now no one's speaking out against the Justice Department's so-called prosecutors who are persecuting Netanyahu for something that so many legal experts have said is not an offense and destroying the unity of our people and interfering with the government? I'd like someone to answer that question.
I'm happy to answer that question because after I arrived in Israel, I was recruited by the Prime Minister and did submit a brief to Attorney General Mandelblit on the fact that it should not be considered a bribe to be subjected and agreed to favorable publicity. So I agree with you. I think Jews should speak out on that. I think the Israeli press, unfortunately, is one-sided against Netanyahu. And you see in the Israeli press a kind of a mirror image of the American press. I mean, again, if you're an American and you follow what goes on in the United States, the press is against the president. In Israel, the press is against the prime minister. And I agree, those who speak out and are ready to speak out in favor of the prime minister should do so. But I think that's one of the lessons that one learns from what happened in the 1940s and compared with what happened with regard to Soviet Jewry. When the Jews spoke out on Soviet Jewry in the United States, it had an effect. And that, I think, is what my father was calling for in 1940.
What was the relationship?
Wait, is it?
Thank you.
Is that Professor Slonim? Professor Slonim?
Thank you.
Thank you for joining. This is Professor Shlomo Slonim, formerly Hebrew University. I'm delighted to have you join us today.
Thank you. I would like to know what was the relationship between Stephen Wise and Abba Hillel Silver? And to what extent was Silver involved in openly criticizing Wise's stand, or doing something more positive himself with regard to rescuing Jews?
The relationship between Rabbi Wise and Rabbi Silver is a very important part of this story, and I do explore it in depth in the book. Silver's challenge to Wise illustrates a number of important aspects of this of the phenomenon we're discussing here, failures of Jewish leadership, etc. Although I want to say at the outset of my brief reply to you, Rabbi Silver's challenge, Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver's challenge to Rabbi Stephen Wise was not with regard to the issue of rescue. Rabbi Silver's challenge was the question of the leadership of the American Zionist movement and the extent to which American Zionists should be forceful in challenging President Roosevelt. Now, there is a certain blurring of lines, of course, between the Zionist struggle and the struggle for rescue because, among other things, rescue activists were urging that Jews be saved and brought to Eretz Israel, which was a logical position, more logical than bring to America, if for no other reason than because of the close proximity of the Middle East to Europe. Rabbi Silver, in general, argued that Rabbi Wise was insufficiently outspoken, insufficiently forceful on the question of pressing for Jewish statehood, of pushing the administration, the president, to openly support creating a Jewish state in Palestine. That was the core of Silver's challenge. At one point, in 1943-44, Silver was appointed co-chairman, along with Wise, of the American Zionist movement, which in those days was known as the American Zionist Emergency Council. It was the umbrella group for all the Zionist groups. Something comparable to, let's say today, if the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, it's an umbrella for 50-odd U.S. Jewish groups. So the American Zionist Emergency Council was the umbrella for 8 major American Zionist groups. Under Wise's leadership, the Zionist Emergency Committee took a very measured approach. It did not openly challenge the president or the administration on the issue of promoting Jewish statehood. Silver's argument was that, among other things, that the way to get to the president, the way to get to Roosevelt on the issue of Zionism in Palestine, was to court the Republicans, to establish relations also on the other side of the political aisle. I mentioned earlier that Rabbi Wise, because of his strong affinity for President Roosevelt, had relationships with prominent Democrats, but none with the Republican Party. And as you know, in American politics, you really have to have connections on both sides of the aisle. You have to have relationships with both parties in order to be the most effective. Obviously, American Jews had no relationships with the Republicans, then a Democrat president, FDR, had no reason to fear that Jews might ever establish an alliance with the Republicans or vote Republican. As long as he felt that the Jews were in his pocket, so to speak, that diluted Jewish political power. So Abba Hillel Silver came into this setting with the sense that there was an opportunity to court the Republicans. This is based in part because he came from Cleveland, where he personally had a strong relationship with one of the most prominent Republican senators, Robert Taft. It wasn't that Silver was personally a Republican. He was not. He was what we would call an independent. But because he was a prominent rabbi in Ohio, he had a pre-existing relationship with Robert Taft, who was one of the leaders of the Republicans. Silver, I'll wrap it up. Silver and Benzion Netanyahu essentially hit on the same important idea at the same time, and that was that they should go to the Republicans in that election year of 1944 and urge the Republicans to embrace Zionism. Now here I think I'm going to stop my story because I expect that Ido Netanyahu in his remarks a little earlier will be touching on this subject. So I'm going to leave that the important end to their efforts. Not coordinated. Silver and Netanyahu barely knew each other, but what they did in regard to courting the Republicans is an extremely important part of this broader story. Silver and Wise battled back and forth. They both had big egos, and neither could tolerate the other. So this period where they were co-chairmen of the American Zionist movement, it didn't last long. The honeymoon did not last long. And after about a year, Wise pushed Silver out. Wise managed to engineer a kind of coup, and he embarrassed Silver into resigning, but he was in fact forced out of the leadership of the Zionist movement for a time, then later made a comeback. But this ongoing struggle between Silver and Wise, first of all, it sapped energy that should have been focused on rescue. I mean, it's obvious. It's obvious not just, I think, in retrospect. Even at the time, there were many critics who said, why are they fighting over this question of Palestine? And meanwhile, there might be no Jews left to go to Palestine. So the first problem with the Wise-Silver clash was that they were diverting their energy into these intra-Jewish struggles when the greater issue of rescue, which should have united all Jewish leaders at that time, was often being pushed aside. Yes, could you pass the microphone back?
The one thing I just want to add to that is that it does seem to me, in terms of looking again at actions, that whereas Silver, at least from what I could gather from my father's reaction about him, Rabbi Eliezer Silver, with whom he worked very closely, Silver was a very clever leader of the Orthodox community. I can't speak to the Zionist aspect of it, but it appears to me that the march, which after all Silver led, over Wise's opposition, and Wise denigrating that march, and yet Silver led it, indicates that although Silver...
No, that's Eliezer Silver.
Eliezer.
We're talking about
Abba Hillel Silver.
Yes.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, just two things. One is a fact. My understanding is that Rabbi Eliezer Silver also was in close contact with Senator Taft later on.
Well, he was, right. I mean, Eliezer Silver was a very close associate of Senator Taft. And in terms of Republicans, I don't know exactly how he voted. I would not have been surprised if he had voted Republican. My father voted Republican. My father supported Eisenhower against Adlai Stevenson. And so it was not so surprising that the Orthodox community, unlike the secular community, was at different times supportive of the Republican Party. And Robert Taft, after all, was very helpful with regard to the projects that Eliezer Silver had promoted.
Right. I don't know Rabbi Eliezer Silver voted, but I know he would call on Senator Taft for help, and Senator Taft would be responsive. But that's not what I wanted to ask. You both referred a number of times to what the Reform and the Conservative were doing, what the Black Hats Orthodox were doing. I was wondering if you could mention what the non-Black Hat Orthodox were doing at the time.
Well, the Orthodox Union then was known by its earlier name, the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations, but the OU, the Orthodox Union, and the National Council of Young Israel were the two most prominent, what we would call modern Orthodox groups in those days. But they were relatively small. They were not active on the political scene. Now today we are accustomed to the OU and the National Council of Young Israel taking positions on public policy issues. But that was not really the case in the 1940s. The OU was really focused on Jewish ritual, what's called Jewish ritual issues and synagogue building, as was the National Council of Young Israel in its own segment. So we don't find them, in the documents, you don't find them weighing in on political issues, lobbying in Washington, that sort of thing. They were not yet at the point in their organizational history where they were politically involved.
Hello. Considering the attitudes of the time, it seems to me that even if every Jew in America had screamed from the rooftops about what is happening to your Jews in Europe, nothing would probably have been done, considering what was going on in America at the time, the attitude about Jews and so on. I wonder whether you respond to that, please.
I think that there's certainly a lot to be said for that conclusion. That doesn't mean that the Jews of America should not have tried various ways. My father's view, and there were various views at the time, that the Nazis believed, my father said it in his articles, that the Nazis believed that they were doing the world a favor, that the world would be thankful to the Germans once Hitler succeeded for the fact that they had eradicated this terrible race. And it was important in terms of that to get to them the message from neutral countries, from the United States, from Great Britain, that that was not true. They were not going to be thanked for getting rid of the Jews. They were going to be condemned. If they lost, they were going to prosecute. That message, according to my father, and according to those who were active in terms of rescue, was a message that had to be sent by the United States through the United Nations, which at that point was still considered at the very end as being a respectable voice that would be listened to by the German government. So, sure, it was very, very difficult. And my father's articles say it's very difficult, but nonetheless you have to try. And the problem is that the American Jewish community did not try.
I understand. Now, I would answer the question a little differently. I would measure the prospects for American Jewish influence according to what was actually achieved when some American Jewish activists did the kinds of things that we're talking that we wish more had done. Now, let me elaborate on that. When I have had occasion over the years to interview individual rabbis who took part in that march, and here I don't believe that any of them are still with us, but over the past 10 or 15 years, I had the opportunity to interview 7 or 8 of them. The Wyman Institute created an oral history library of their personal recollections. So, for example, the Boston Rebbe and Rav Binyamin Kamenetsky and a few others. So what they all said to me was that, one of the questions I would often ask them was, after the march was over, did you ever speak about it in your shul, in your community, even in later years, have you ever talked about it? None of them ever had. None of them ever, and I asked why. And they said because as far as we're concerned, it was a failure. Now, I understand from their perspective why they thought it was a failure. They came to the gates of the White House. 5 of their leaders asked for permission to spend a few minutes with the president and hand him a petition, and they were turned away. And as they discovered later, they were turned away based on a lie. They were told that the president was unavailable. And in fact, we know now from the documents that the president was in the White House that afternoon and had no appointments the whole afternoon. He certainly was available. He simply chose not to. But so they considered it a failure because they believed that the president never heard their plea, and therefore nothing resulted from it. And every one of them was very surprised when I described to them what Professor Wyman and other historians and I had found in our research. And that, in a nutshell, was this. The march was critically important because it put the issue of rescue not only on the front pages of the next day's newspapers in Washington, but also right in front of the eyes of Congress. Because before they went to the White House, they first marched to the Capitol, and they were greeted on the steps of the Capitol by a number of very prominent senators and congressmen. Also Vice President Wallace, who I can talk about separately. Shortly after they met with the congressmen and then marched to the White House, shortly after this happened, the Bergson Group persuaded several members of Congress to introduce a resolution calling on the president to create a government agency to rescue Jewish refugees. Obviously, this is described in much greater detail in the book. But the essence of this anecdote is the way to change government policy in Washington never consists merely of somebody having a good idea. There has to be a groundswell of public pressure. The White House has to perceive that there's a significant body of public opinion that wants this. The White House has to feel challenged by Congress, that maybe Congress is going to pull the rug out from under the president's feet, so to speak. So that's what the Bergson Group was so good at doing, was creating a political climate in which the Roosevelt administration increasingly felt that there was a groundswell of pressure for rescue. There were rabbis marching, there are articles in the newspapers, now there's a resolution in Congress. What Bergson did not know was that behind the scenes at the very same time, senior aides to Treasury Secretary Morgenthau had discovered that the State Department had been suppressing news about the mass killings and actually obstructing opportunities to rescue Jewish refugees. And these staff members went to Morgenthau, documented what they had discovered, and asked him to go to the president and plead with the president to do something on the rescue issue before Congress went ahead and passed this resolution, or before this scandal of the State Department's obstructionism was exposed. Now we're at the end of 1943, beginning of 1944, meaning it was an election year. And President Roosevelt was, of course, a consummate politician. He understood that a scandal breaking out over his administration's refugee policy, suppressing news, obstructing rescue, that a scandal breaking out would not be good for him. That having Congress debate this resolution, which they were in the midst of doing, debating and publicizing a resolution which in effect challenged the administration by saying, you need a whole new agency to rescue Jews because you're not doing anything. And it was because of this combination of pressure that the Bergson Group had generated, beginning with the rabbis' march, the march by 400 rabbis who thought they had accomplished nothing. It was this chain of events, from the march to the resolution, to the Treasury Department discoveries, to the pressure on Roosevelt, that led the president directly to create that agency, the War Refugee Board, in January 1944. And now I'm going to wrap up this long answer to your short question. The War Refugee Board was given almost no government funding. It was a government agency. It was given almost no government funding because it was created as a political gesture. FDR was throwing a bone to the Jews and to Morgenthau and to those congressmen who were interested in rescue. Just trying to appease them. Here you can have your agency. Gave it almost no funding. The White House almost never cooperated with it. And yet in the 15 months of its existence, the War Refugee Board performed miracles. They sent funds into Europe to bribe Nazis, to shelter Jews. And, this is a very brief summary, most significantly, the War Refugee Board recruited Raoul Wallenberg in Sweden, persuaded him to go to Budapest, finance his entire rescue operation. in Hungary in the waning months of the war. Historians calculate that the War Refugee Board's activities, including what Wallenberg did, played a major role in saving over 200,000 lives in the final 15 months of the war. So, when you ask a question, well, if American Jews had really cried out in significant numbers, would it have made a difference? So, what we see from the historical record is even when they didn't cry out in significant numbers, but when at least a handful of activists, like Isaac Lewin, marched to the White House, or the Berkshire Group with its activities. But even a handful tried something, look how much was achieved, leading then to Professor Wyman's famous question, what if the pressure had begun earlier, and therefore the War Refugee Board had been created earlier? Even a few weeks, a few months. Imagine what a difference it could have made. We don't know the answer definitively. As Nat so eloquently indicated, there's an obligation to try, even if you don't know it'll succeed. But in this case, we do know from the historical record to the extent to which they succeeded, thus leaving the question how much more might have been accomplished had American Jews spoken out earlier.
I haven't.
Excuse me, I think we have time for just one more question.
Yeah, let me just add
before the next
one
break.
very brief point, which I haven't quoted in the discussion I made today, a very early observation by my father, which was, why did the Jewish organizations not move into Washington and not budge? I mean, he said in an early article, the obligation is to come to Washington and just to stay there until you get the response that you want to get. That's all it said. And yet, that was not what was done. And in fact, what was done, as he said in later articles, was once in 40 days, Wise would travel to Washington to speak to somebody in Washington. And that was supposedly the answer to the problem, or his answer to the problem.
Who has the microphone? Yes, could you pass it back there? It's Eliyahu Green.
Thank you. Dr. Minoff, we know that Roosevelt depended to a great extent in his electoral politics. He depended on certain Jewish labor leaders, such as Sidney Hillman and David Levinsky, who led these two garment workers unions, especially Hillman. Now, I would like to know what role they may have played or did not play in rescue efforts or in inducing Roosevelt to be more flexible or to be more welcoming, if possible, towards Jewish refugees or towards the Jewish victims under Nazi control. Did Sidney Hillman, who was so influential, that it was said that Roosevelt once said, ask Sidney if it's okay, whatever it was, but ask Sidney. So he was very influential on Roosevelt, or seems to have been. Did he play any role, positive or negative, towards the rescue and efforts?
I have seen no evidence that Sidney Hillman ever approached the president on Jewish issues. Hillman was one of a number of Jews who were in what we'll call Roosevelt's inner circle. Advisors, speechwriters like Sam Rosenman, unofficial advisors like Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. These were Jews who had the president's ear, but felt personally uncomfortable about being seen, potentially, being seen by the public as being too interested in Jewish issues. So they almost never, in the case of Hillman, Frankfurter, Rosenman, almost never pressed on Jewish issues. We spoke about Morgenthau at several points today. Morgenthau began with that same reluctance. He, too, was a very deeply acculturated, a German-descended Jew who felt it wasn't his place to talk about Jewish concerns in the White House. But under the pressure of events, before it's too late, Morgenthau finally did speak up. Unfortunately, Morgenthau was the exception who proved the rule. But of course, you might say that the only kind of Jew who could reach Roosevelt's inner circle was the kind whom the president expected would never bring up Jewish issues. Someone like Ben Cohen, for example, who was one of the architects of New Deal legislation. We actually have documents where he specifically memos he wrote to colleagues saying, I am not going to bring up Jewish issues because that's not my place. So we have a tragedy here of Jews kind of reaching, next to the throne, but not wanting to go any further. Now, they might have said, well, if I start bothering the president about Jewish issues, then he won't listen to me anymore. And that could be, but there was no way to know until they tried. And in Morgenthau's case, Morgenthau's decision to stop keeping quiet, backed by the events and developments that I've just described, did result in the president doing something. So you really never quite know what combination of factors could, in a given situation, have influenced the president in one direction or another. So ultimately, the Jews in Roosevelt's circle were individuals who we might say had at least some opportunity to make an effort, and in almost all cases chose not to. This will have to be the last question. Yes. Can you pass it back there?
I'm very interested in history and Virginia itself. And Professor Lewin, I know that you're a professor at Columbia University. I'm a great admirer of yours. I'm an attorney myself. Why are American Jewish leaders notoriously being quiet about the scourge of anti-Semitism on American universities today? Your university was voted in 2015, before the last presidential election, as the most anti-Semitic university in the United States by the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Why are American Jewish leaders keeping quiet about this?
First of all, let me tell you that my teaching at Columbia as an adjunct professor in the last quarter century has now become an embarrassment. And I've said to friends, I don't know really what I should be doing now as a result of the fact that Columbia has become a hotbed of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I mean, it's outrageous. I did send a letter to the president protesting the fact that the Prime Minister of Malaysia was invited to speak by Columbia. I thought that was outrageous. I think it's outrageous that they're allowing Palestinian professors to intimidate Jewish students on the Columbia campus. And I'm saddened by the fact that the Jewish students who were going to Columbia and not too many of them seem to have been won over by the BDS movement. The whole thing is a great tragedy in terms of the United States. I think that it is the obligation of Jews in universities around the United States to speak out and to take the position that this is an outrage of what's going on in the United States. And I hope that they will do that.
Thank you, Ned. We'll take a break now and then reconvene promptly at 3 o'clock to hear Ido Netanyahu discuss